They were breaking down 8 players that are absolutely skyrocketing in 2025 fantasy football rankings. These are players that I'm seeing consistently drafted at higher ADPs than they were being drafted a month ago. And I am telling you right now, come August time, these players are going to be even more aggressively drafted, and you need to start paying attention to them now. Let's start the video off with De'Von Achane of the Miami Dolphins. This was a player that I was consistently seeing being drafted through the month of June, the beginning of the second round, sometimes even in the mid-second round. But I am now seeing De'Von Achane go as early as the first round. I have seen fantasy football drafts where he is being drafted as a top 8, top 9 player in the first round of fantasy football drafts. I'm also seeing plenty of drafts where he still falls to the end of the first round and plenty of drafts where he is still going at the beginning of the second round. But the point being is that he is absolutely locked in as a early second round selection. And I'm seeing more drafts where he is rising up into the first round, especially on Underdog Fantasy in best ball formats, but still in redraft formats, I'm seeing more and more of you guys out there talk about De'Von Achane as a first round grade player. And we look at things, it makes perfect sense. De'Von Achane has been nothing but productive through his first 2 seasons in the NFL. Did finish as the RB24 through 11 games in his rookie season, but he finished as the RB5 in fantasy points per game in that rookie campaign in 2023 with 17.3 fantasy points per game. Then we looked at last year, finished as the RB5 in full PPR, 17.6 fantasy points per game, and finished as the RB6 in terms of fantasy points per game. We break it down last year. We had 3 single-digit performances through the first 5 weeks of the season, but what we have to remember is that in each and every one of those games where De'Von Achane had single digits in the beginning of the season, Tua Tagovailoa did not play in any of those games. Then we only had one other single-digit fantasy performance out of De'Von Achane last year. That was week 17. Very bad time for that to happen. And guess what? Tua Tagovailoa did not play in that game against the Cleveland Browns as well. So I have heard this argument come up for people who are a little bit more afraid of De'Von Achane and drafting him aggressively. Like, what happens if Tua Tagovailoa, who has missed time through the last couple of seasons with different injuries, he's only played in more than 13 games in one season of his career. That was in 2023, where he was very productive, the quarterback 9 in fantasy that year. But nonetheless, what happens if Tua Tagovailoa misses time this year? What does that look like for De'Von Achane? Well, obviously, it probably isn't good, but I just don't think that we can go off of that. I always hate that kind of argument. I think that De'Von Achane has way too much upside to ignore. And while the quarterback room isn't phenomenal here with Zach Wilson as a QB2 currently listed and 2 rookie quarterbacks behind him, maybe it's still better than what we got last year out of that quarterback room. And listen, the point of this video isn't necessarily to persuade you guys into drafting these players at the ADP that I think they're rising to. It's just to let you guys know that they are rising. And we look at the stretch that De'Von Achane had between weeks 8 and week 17 last year. It was absolutely astronomical what he was able to do. A ton of double-digit fantasy performances like we went over. Lots of upside here, and I'm telling you guys right now, I will not be surprised if De'Von Achane gets kind of locked in to like the 112, 2.1 type area in your fantasy drafts when you guys are drafting in August. All right, another running back who's become pretty much a first-round grade is Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. And this was a player, through the month of June. We were still seeing pretty, frequently go at the beginning of the second round, like in the 2-4, 2-5 area, maybe sometimes slid back to like the 2-6, 2-7. But I mean, once again, with Christian McCaffrey, we are seeing C-Mac go in the first round of best ball drafts on Underdog Fantasy, and he is slowly creeping into that same type of range that De'Von Achane is at. Early second round pick into the first round pick. And there are a lot of people out there who are basically looking at Christian McCaffrey going into August as a first round selection. And I feel like I don't need to break this one down too extensively. There's basically 2 different boats here. You're either in on Christian McCaffrey because we know what Christian McCaffrey is when it comes to fantasy football, or you're out because he just came off of a completely injury-riddled season, and you're still worried about those injuries potentially lingering. When we look at what C-Mac did last year, double-digit games in 2 of the games he played in, and then a bad performance against Green Bay in week 12, but then week 13, right? I mean, between those 2 games in week 12 and week 13, the injuries were popping up. And in week 13 is when, he kind of had this injury that people bring up, and it really concerns a lot of you guys, but you have to look at the conditions that they were playing in. They were basically playing on a frozen field in Buffalo. Anyone could have got hurt in that game, it felt like, right? So, listen, in the games that C-Mac was healthy last year, still saw plenty of production for the most part, still averaged 12 fantasy points per game. Is that good compared to what we typically get out of Christian McCaffrey? Not necessarily, because he had 24.5 fantasy points per game in 2023 and 21 fantasy points per game in 2022. But nonetheless, the upside is there when it comes to Christian McCaffrey. You go to further years back, 2021, 18 fantasy points per game. The year before, 30 fantasy points per game. The year before, 29.3, 24.1, 14.3, has averaged double-digit fantasy points per game at the end of the day, no matter what, in every single season that he has played. He has been the RB2 or better in fantasy points per game in 4 of the last 7 seasons. 2 seasons where he was the RB2 in fantasy points per game, 2 where he was the RB1 in fantasy points per game. So the upside is there, okay? Listen, the offensive line play was not great for the Niners last year. There's a lot of injuries across this team, not just at the running back position for Christian McCaffrey, but also at the wide receiver position. I think that things, even if they don't get to, where we were at in 2023, things will still be much improved here. So I don't mind Christian McCaffrey. At his ADP, I'm more comfortable, drafting him where he was in terms of that 2.4, 2.5, 2.6 area, kind of closer to the mid second round, because I do think that there is some risk associated here. But hey, I cannot argue against the upside and what Christian McCaffrey brings to the table. And he is a player who we've already seen skyrocket in ADP. I think he might kind of be locked into this area. I still think that there's a lot of players on the board in the first round that are going to continue to push C-Mac into that kind of very end of the first round, beginning of the second round type area, especially in redraft formats. But once again, in best ball formats, I've seen Christian McCaffrey drafted as early as pick 8, pick 7, and I've even seen some of you guys talk about him getting selected even earlier. So Christian McCaffrey, we know what the upside is here. We know why he's moving up in ADP, and he is probably going to be locked in as a first round grade in the month of August. All right, let's move along to the wide receiver position for a minute, and let's talk about Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants, currently sitting at an ADP of 9.6 on the Sleeper app, coming off of a fantastic rookie campaign. Don't need to break this down extensively, but he was the wide receiver 6 last year in full PPR. You guys see the stats on the screen. Finished with 18.2 fantasy points per game in his rookie campaign. We look to Malik Neighbors in terms of what he did. 1 single-digit fantasy performance against Philadelphia in week 7. Outside of that, double digits in every single game, and he had 170 targets last year with bad quarterback play. Jamar Chase had 175 targets. Malik Neighbors had more targets than any other wide receiver going in the first round outside of Jamar Chase. Listen, Malik Neighbors is due for a fantastic sophomore season, and I know that everyone has been in on Malik Neighbors throughout this offseason, right? And he's been going in the first round. He is still going early in fantasy drafts, that is for sure. But I think that ADP of 9.6 that you guys see on this Sleeper app and where he's being drafted in best ball drafts right now, it is slowly moving up, right? Earlier in the offseason, you wouldn't see a lot of people draft guys like CeeDee Lamb or Amon-Ra St. Brown and even Nico Collins to a degree after Malik Neighbors. And I would even put Puka Nacua in that discussion. Now you're seeing a lot of people more comfortable drafting Malik Neighbors in that next tier wide receiver. I think we basically have Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. Some people might argue CeeDee Lamb's in that first tier. Some people might argue Puka Nacua's in that first tier. But wherever that tier breaks into the second tier wide receivers, like I said, I still think it's Chase JJ at the very top. People are very comfortable now having Malik Neighbors as their first graded wide receiver for 2025 after Chase and JJ are off of the board. But there's a really good bunch of wide receivers here. We just named most of them, but CeeDee Lamb, Puka Nacua, Neighbors, B-Tom, Amon-Ra, Nico Collins, and even moving into the second round with guys like A.J. Brown, Ladd McConkey, Drake London. It's a really strong stretch of wide receivers in the first round, moving into the second round of fantasy drafts right now. And so, listen, I think no matter what, you're getting a great wide receiver, and there's a lot of arguments and a lot of different directions about how, the rankings should go here. But like I said, a lot of people really comfortable just saying Malik Neighbors is my guy, due for a fantastic sophomore season, had an incredible rookie season, expecting better quarterback play, or maybe at least more stable quarterback play in 2025. I'm telling you guys right now, I'm seeing it left and right. Malik Neighbors can be drafted as early as the 1-5, 1-6, 1-7 in fantasy drafts. I think he's going to continue to move up just a couple spots in ADP, but it's definitely enough that you guys need to start paying attention to it now. All right, let's talk about another sophomore wide receiver. That is Ladd McConkey of the LA Chargers, sitting with an ADP of 20.4 on the Sleeper app. And this is, another name that I'm just seeing really move up in ADP. I mean, I remember earlier in the offseason where Ladd McConkey would sometimes still be available at the beginning of the third round and was kind of consistently being drafted towards the end of the second round. And he is just like progressively throughout the offseason moved up in ADP little by little. And I'm seeing Ladd McConkey drafted as early as the 2.1 in redraft formats right now. And I think you could even argue that he could go at the end of the first round if you're looking to start your draft with the wide receiver position. You're ignoring guys like Devon Achane, Ashton Jeanty, C-Mac, Derrick Henry. You're going for a player like B-Tom, Amon-Ra, Nico Collins, and then coming around that turn and going for a second wide receiver. If Ladd McConkey is your guy, I could easily see him still going at the turn in the second round or even at the end of the first round. So, listen, this is also a player that I'm seeing is kind of left and right, like really high in a lot of kind of experts' rankings. A player that a lot of fantasy experts are talking about, like this is going to be the guy who's going to have a huge sophomore season. So seeing his name brought up a lot amongst the fantasy community, but also seeing his name brought up a lot when it comes to you guys out there who I'm doing a lot of drafts with. And once again, this is a player that's heavily targeted in Underdog best ball drafts right now as well. 15.1 fantasy points per game in his rookie campaign. The wide receiver 13. You guys see the stats on the screen there. Last year was kind of interesting for the Chargers because Justin Herbert, I mean, he started the season and everything, but he fought through a lot of injuries, some injuries from the offseason and then some early injuries. And we saw that the Chargers really stick to that kind of, run the football, play defense type of game plan week in and week out. And then slowly but surely, starting around like week 8, we saw them start to throw the football a lot more. Week 8, Justin Herbert had 32 passing attempts. Really, it was kind of the 2 weeks before, week 6, 34 passing attempts. Week 7, 39 passing attempts. They were just a little bit more successful starting in week 8. And more importantly, Justin Herbert throwing 4 more touchdowns, most of which went to Ladd McConkey. That was that big game in week 8 against the Saints when Ladd McConkey had 2 receiving touchdowns. So right now, cross our fingers, all things are looking like Justin Herbert's going into the season fully healthy, which is going to absolutely benefit Ladd McConkey. And this is another player, I don't really feel like I need to break this down extensively. You guys have probably heard a lot of talk about Ladd McConkey. I know a lot of you guys in the community are really high on Ladd McConkey, but this is the player, I think out of all the players on today's list, this is the player throughout the course of the offseason I have seen move up the most in ADP. Like I said, sometimes was still available at the beginning of the third round, early in the offseason. This is a player, I think he's locked in to the beginning of the second round, no matter how you guys want to look at it as we approach the month of August. All right, switching gears back to the running back position, let's talk about my guy, Isaiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs, currently sitting at an ADP of 64 on the sleeper app. And obviously Pacheco, disappointing year last year, was a player who was being pretty aggressively drafted like beginning of the third round, would sometimes even go at the end of the second round. And for good reason. 2023 was a really successful year for Pacheco, the RB15 in terms of full PPR, 15.3 fantasy points per game in 2023, had a really good playoff push for those of you guys who owned him in 2023. And on paper, the Chiefs offense looked better than ever last offseason with, the addition of Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy added to that offense. Then we saw great things out of Rashee Rice in his rookie season, right? And then we saw a lot of injuries to the Chiefs offense, including Isaiah Pacheco. But what's important to remember is that Pacheco started the year very, very good. 15.8 fantasy points against Baltimore in week 1, 16.1 in week 2, then missed weeks 3 through 12, and then didn't give us any double-digit fantasy performances weeks 13 through 17. 8.1 or less fantasy points in each of those games, and 5.9 or less in all of those except for one. We still saw plenty of touches go to Kareem Hunt. And in my opinion, Pacheco just wasn't 100% at the end of the season, was able to play through the playoffs and the Super Bowl, but just wasn't 100%. And I think, once again, this is a player that we can look at now with a full off season and look into the coming season and say he is going to be healthy and we can expect better things. Now, I won't be surprised if we see some volume throughout the year go to guys like Kareem Hunt and Elijah Mitchell. Some people high on rookie Brashard Smith out of SMU as well. But ultimately, Pacheco, I think, will be the lead back for the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, earlier in the offseason, you could see Pacheco fall into the 7th round, late 6th round, just kind of I would say, where the dead zone area running backs are. Some of the rookies, some of the guys in handcuff type situations, some of the guys who maybe have injury concerns, right? And now I'm starting to see Pacheco being confidently drafted closer to the beginning of the 6th, sometimes still the mid-6th round, but as early as the 5th round. You look at some of the names here, like James Conner, RJ Harvey, David Montgomery, Aaron Jones, Quinshon Judkins, Isaiah Pacheco, Trayvon Henderson, Pollard, Swift, Brian Robinson Jr., Caleb Johnson, Najee Harris. Listen, this is kind of the area of running backs where it comes down to preference, right? And there's a lot of arguments, a lot of different directions for why you should be drafting different players here. But I think that ultimately people are back in on Pacheco. And I've seen Pacheco go, like I said, as early as the 5th round, closer to the Monty, Aaron Jones area. I still think James Conner, RJ Harvey are going to go before Pacheco in most drafts. But I think that Pacheco is definitely solidifying himself in that draft position that you guys are seeing in a lot of drafts as well. And once again, I think that people are just back in on this Chiefs offense. I know recency bias has us looking at the Super Bowl and bad performance, but once again, they're going to go into the season hopefully with better offensive line play than last year, but definitely with far less injuries than they had last year. Hollywood Brown's going to be healthy. Rashee Rice is going to be back. Xavier Worthy did great things in his rookie season. Pacheco is going to be healthy. And listen, I know Travis Kelce is getting up there, but Noah Gray has shown plenty of flashes at the tight end position as well. So I think between those two tight ends, they'll be completely fine at the tight end position. So I'm fine with Pacheco where he's being drafted. I like him better, kind of mid 6th round. Even early 6th round, I think is fine. But once again, this is a player that I'm seeing being targeted in a lot of best ball drafts as well, in that range of running backs that people are going out and saying, in this type of area in the draft, this is the player that I want. So make sure you guys are keeping a close eye on Isaiah Pacheco as we get closer to the month of August. All right, next up we have Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans. And this is a player that I have loved all off season long. He's sitting at an ADP of 76.5 on the Sleeper app, but I am not seeing Calvin Ridley drafted in the 7th round, and at times not even in the 6th round in fantasy football drafts at this current point in time. I have seen Calvin Ridley go as early as the 5th round, and I see him be drafted a lot more aggressively in underdog drafts on fantasy, but I'm also seeing his ADP creep up on redraft formats as well. And I mean, really, I've seen Calvin Ridley in that range of Zay Flowers, Jamison Williams, Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave, Jerry Jeudy, Chris Godwin. And before, earlier in the offseason, this was a player who was being drafted next to the likes of guys like Khalil Shakir, Jacoby Myers, Jawan Jennings, right? And I do like that kind of tier wide receivers, but Ridley has really moved up. And I think for good reason. And like I said, this is a player that I've talked about a lot throughout the course of the offseason. Over 1,000 receiving yards in each of the last 2 seasons, 4 more receiving touchdowns in each of the last 2 seasons, and it has averaged double-digit fantasy points per game in each of the last 2 seasons. And the quarterback play will be better this year with Cam Ward. And it's like, sure, maybe you're not a Cam Ward truther or whatever, but it's got to be better than the combination of Will Levis and Mason Rudolph that we got last year. And literally, when we look at things, Calvin Ridley was number 1 out of all wide receivers in air yards in 2024. Number 1, had over 1,800 yards in air yards. That is 110.8 air yards per game. And he only finished with 1,017 receiving yards. That generally means that he was open, he was running the routes correctly, but the quarterback was not getting him the football at the end of the day. It will be better this year. Overall, this offense on paper looks better than it did last year. I like the run game for the Titans with Pollard and Tajay Spears. Tyler Lockett, Van Jefferson, LK Manor, the rookie, Chicken Conquo, tight end. I think that the receiver room will be good enough behind Calvin Ridley with Cam Ward at the quarterback position that this offense, well, they may not be the best offense in the league. They may not be close to winning this division yet, but they can still be very fantasy relevant. And Calvin Ridley, like I said, has not been that bad the past 2 seasons. And just don't forget, just remember the Calvin Ridley hype trains that we've had, over the last 2 years, especially going into 2023. He's not that far removed. Wide receivers can still be very productive between the years of age 30 and 32. So I'm good with Calvin Ridley. Even where he's being drafted a little bit more aggressively right now, I think he's going to be a very, very solid flex play going into 2025. Next up, let's take a look at J.K. Dobbins, newly acquired running back for the Denver Broncos, currently going at an ADP of 142.1 on the Sleeper app. But I am telling you guys right now, he is not being drafted at that ADP. I do think that his ADP is a little bit all over the place because both on the Sleeper app and on Underdog Fantasy, his ADP is still a little bit pushed back. But I've seen J.K. Dobbins be targeted in the 8th round, in the 9th round, in the 10th round, in the 11th round. It is kind of all over the place. And I've seen a lot of drafts, and even admittedly drafts that I've been in where people forget about J.K. Dobbins because he's still a bit buried in rankings. And there are even times where I'm like, oh man, I can't believe I forgot about J.K. Dobbins because I like Dobbins a lot going into this year. I like R.J. Harvey as much as the next guy, but I just really don't believe that J.K. Dobbins was brought into this offensive system for no reason. We look at what Dobbins has done the last 3 seasons, averaged 14.8 fantasy points per game last year, was very productive overall last year for the Chargers. There were some up and down moments. There were some injuries, kind of expected out of J.K. Dobbins, but at the end of the day was a top 25 fantasy football running back last year, and he averaged 11.1 fantasy points in 2023. Only played 1 game and averaged 10.2 fantasy points in 2022, only played 8 games. But when Dobbins is on the field, he's an absolute factor, right? I think he's a very good handcuff. If you're an RJ Harvey, like complete truther, Dobbins is still a good handcuff, even with the injury history. If something happens to Harvey, Dobbins is going to be in line for a lot of touches. But once again, I think this is going to be a very good 1-2 punch. The run game for the Broncos last year was essentially non-existent. I think they will get it going in 2025. I think that Dobbins is going to be a big part of this offense. So I'm all in on seeing him being drafted more aggressively. But the point of this video, once again, is not necessarily to persuade you guys to start drafting these players, to let you guys know that these players are being drafted a bit more aggressively and at different ADPs than maybe their average ADP is telling you guys, right? So at the end of the day, I would definitely say if you want to draft J.K. Dobbins, you need to keep a close eye on him in fantasy drafts. This is a player that has said, like I said, I have seen him go as early as the 9th round. You look at some of the running backs, like in the 8th round through 9th round in a redraft format, Jalen Morin, ETN, Tyrone Tracy, Jordan Mason, Javonte Williams, Zach Charbonnet, Tajay Spears, Cam Scatterbo, Ramondre Stevenson, Rashad White, Bashal Tootin, Dobbins, I could see being drafted over any of those guys. I could see plenty of those guys being drafted before Dobbins, but there's an argument for Dobbins to go before any of those guys, especially with the production we saw out of Dobbins when he was healthy last year. So if Dobbins is a player that is on your draft board, you need to be paying very close attention as we approach August. Last but not least, let's talk about a wide receiver, and that is Darnell Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons, currently sitting at an ADP of 109.1. But once again, this is a player I'm seeing being drafted before that ADP. The last draft that I did with our community, Darnell Mooney went at the 8.9 overall, right? This is a player that I was pretty commonly targeting in the 10th, 11th round of redraft drafts. I just don't think he's going to go in that area come August time. And this is another player who's really popular in best ball formats on Underdog as well. This was a top 31 wide receiver last year. When you say that out loud, it doesn't sound great. And don't get me wrong, it's not ideal, but he's being drafted outside the top 100 players. And he's a top 30 wide receiver essentially last year. Just under 1,000 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, 12.1 fantasy points per game, 15.5 yards per catch. You guys see most of those stats on the screen. And what Mooney provides is a nice amount of upside. There's going to be some inconsistency here, but Mooney is a nice flex play, and we're expecting the quarterback play under Michael Penix in his sophomore season to be better than what we got out of Kirk Cousins last year. If you're in on the kind of Falcons hype train, which we got another one this offseason, right, under Michael Penix compared to what we got last year out of Kirk Cousins at quarterback, then there's no reason that you should not be in on Darnell Mooney going into the season. And like I said, this is a player that I've been targeting a lot throughout the offseason. I'm not surprised whatsoever to see him being drafted more consistently and more aggressively throughout this point in the offseason. And once again, this is a wide receiver too on an offense that's kind of humming right now, that's popular, that has some buzz to it. And I just won't be surprised come August time if he's kind of solidified into the 8th round area. You look at a redraft setting in the end of the 7th into the 8th round, maybe even into the 9th round here. Cooper Kupp, Jaden Reed, Stephon Diggs, Josh Downs, Darnell Mooney, Brandon Ayuk, Matthew Golden, Trey Harris, Jaden Higgins. There's certainly an argument for Darnell Mooney over any of those guys. Maybe not over Diggs, Reed, Downs, Kupp is where it gets closer, but there's certainly a lot of argument for him to be right there with those guys compared to where he was being drafted earlier in the offseason, closer to guys like Marvin Mims and Jalen McMillan and Rashad Bateman, Rashid Shaheed, who I think are fine where they're going at their ADP, but for Mooney to be going a little bit higher, I think is also perfectly fine. So Darnell Mooney's on your draft board, just like every other player in today's video. Make sure you guys are keeping a close eye on him as we approach the month of August. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 8 players that are skyrocketing up fantasy football rankings here in the month of July, and players that you have to keep a close eye on as we get closer to the month of August. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year round. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. More importantly, if you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, be sure to drop them down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.